Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. If you're new to the Authority File, you can listen to and find previous episodes on all of the major podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, and on our website, choice360.org. My guest for this series is Dr. Deanna Reder. Dr. Reder is a Cree-Métis literature scholar. Her latest book is called Autobiography as Indigenous Intellectual Tradition, Cree and Métis âcimisowina, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Dr. Reder has had an enormous impact on the development and growth of Indigenous literature studies in Canada. She's the current chair of the Department of Indigenous Studies at Simon Fraser University. Since 2007, she's helped build courses and curriculum at Simon Fraser to establish Indigenous studies as a separate discipline from post-colonial studies and Canadian literature. She served as series editor for Indigenous Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University Press from 2010 to 2021, developed workshops on how to teach Indigenous literatures, helped establish the Indigenous Literary Studies Association, co-founded the Indigenous Editors Association, and co-chairs the Indigenous Voices Awards, an awards program for Indigenous writers. I mention all of this because the study of Indigenous literature as a distinct discipline that brings with it specific methods of instruction and learning is a comparatively recent undertaking. It was only in 2001, when Dr. Reder began her doctoral work, that the field began to shift and orient itself toward a more authentic and more broadly recognized scholarly undertaking. In the next 4 episodes of this series, which is provided with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press, Dr. Reder and I discuss her research background, her new book, The Growth of Indigenous Literature Studies, and her role in its development. In this second episode of our 4-part series, we take a deeper dive into Dr. Reder's book, how it came about, and some of the external inspirations for her study of Indigenous autobiography. Okay, so let's talk about your book, Autobiography as Indigenous Intellectual Tradition. How did that book come about? It's I think based on your graduate work, correct?
It is. It is I just have to say that when I was writing my PhD, you could get other people's dissertations if you applied through ProQuest in the library, and it was really quite difficult to access. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that my dissertation would be so readily available by just downloads. And in 2007 and since then. And I often think of it as sort of my unfinished homework. I was really struggling through a lot of ideas, but core to that was this idea of the role of autobiography. And I have to preface that by saying that it's because the field of Native American autobiography studies is led by non-Indigenous scholars who often repeat a phrase or an idea that is not true, which is that Indians don't like to talk about themselves. That there's no such thing as autobiography, that's a European invention, and that the only reason why Indigenous authors have ever written an autobiography is because they had contact with settlers, and they decided to do so in for reasons to do with that. And the basic logic of that just doesn't make any sense. I mean, novels and autobiographies and poetry, all of these genres do not belong to Europe. Indigenous authors have adopted and adapted these all kinds of forms, like everybody does, and have made them their own. But in the case of autobiography, there's been such an important role of speaking only from your own position, from valuing that position that predated sort of the written autobiography. And so I wanted to follow up on that and give a bunch of writing from the 19th and 20th centuries additional airtime because they hadn't really been properly evaluated.
Yeah. Yeah, and in the introduction to your book, you in a really fascinating and heartwarming way, you tell sort of the story of your mother and how she talked about her past and herself and how that kind of helped you understand the way autobiography works. In this context. And you also mentioned how feminist standpoint methodology helped shift your focus on Indigenous autobiography studies. And I wonder if you can explain what that is and how that caused you to look at your research differently for this book.
I think it's the scholars who talked about how you actually have a improved perspective if you are being oppressed, that you can
Mm,
actually critique the machine better if you understand its blind spots. That made me gave me a lot of assurance that the kinds of criticisms I had wasn't just because I was inadequate as a scholar, but actually that as an Indigenous person, noticing what was never talked about was actually of value. And
mhm.
so I think I certainly think that that very basic premise that feminists have articulated, that there's no unbiased position, that in fact that where you stand, everybody stands in their own position and therefore is influenced by it as they report on the world or as they discuss things.
Right.
Was really really energizing to me, and I think I recognized that it resonated with how I understood Indigenous worldviews as well.
Excellent. So, how did drawing from your own experience, your âcimisowin, benefit your research? At the time, you realized Indigenous literature scholars were advocating new approaches that focused on specific tribal worldviews to most effectively study the literature, correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
And so part of it also, I think, is worth mentioning is that having grown up with so many, autobiographical stories or âcimisowina life experience stories is what Joanna Archibald calls them,
Mhm.
rather than what are considered sort of traditional legends and the kind of story cycles of or the epics of, in this my case, the Cree worldview,
Right.
was I came to realize wasn't it only a deficiency. Obviously, I think being able to draw on more is more. I would love to have grown up hearing Wissahichuk stories, but I didn't. Instead, I grew up hearing family stories. And in those stories, I began to realize that the same, rather than the intellectual inheritance wasn't lost, but it was instead embedded in a different way. A lot
Mhm.
of the values and sort of imagery of these family stories and these autobiographical stories were actually another way to contribute to approaching the literature. So typically, if you think about Indigenous literary nationalism, you think about, well, what's the canon of that particular nation, And in my case, the canon was âcimisowina,
Mhm. And so that differed from nation to nation, then, I guess, in terms of how you looked at that as a scholar, correct?
So, I mean, I think especially when you have an English department that only has, one course on Indigenous literatures and maybe 5 or 10 from the, British Isles. You
Hmm.
realize that we expect a lot from that one course, and we never think to
Right.
ourselves that actually Stalo ways of seeing the world is going to be a lot different than Cree. And the Stalo story cycles are way different than Cree story cycles, for example, and and whatever nation it is. And so
Hmm.
those are really interesting ways to look at a body of literature as as a extension of that canon. But I think what my work has contributed is that fact that also life experience stories, or âcimisowina story, as also its own extension of that canon and another way of approaching things.
Great. Can you explain? I think this segues kind of nicely into this question. Can you explain what you mean by the way Indigenous knowledge is inseparable from Indigenous language? And then how does that influence the scholarship?
Well, I have to say this by first proclaiming that I am still a beginning learner of Cree, and I am grateful
Mm.
to both Arden Og and Solomon Rat for helping me with the making sure that the Cree was correct. My mom was a fluent Cree speaker, and her generation were, but even my cousins who grew up in the north don't speak very fluently, if at all. And so I say this. I discuss Indigenous languages, from that perspective. I don't want to give the impression that I'm a fluent speaker, but I think there's such a movement now that is affirming what's been said for a very long time, which is that if you lose the language, you lose the whole world views that go along with it. And so the kinds of entries I've been able to make into my particular area, so Cree-Métis writing, by going through certain words and unpacking them. Maria Campbell calls it word bundles. That you take these concepts in the language, and you start to think about what other words they're related to, and what the stems are, and what the imagery is, and that kind of thing. And that's how, I think, helped me tremendously in being able to explain the concepts that I've been trying to apply to the work I've been doing. But I think that this is something that's been discussed a lot. I think that if there's a activism that's happening among young people right now, it's Indigenous people, is learning their languages,
Mm.
and there's a huge, I think, a generational shift underway. And a lot of that is not just to connect with family, or to preserve a heritage, but it's really to try to have a stronger access to sort of ancestral knowledge, if you want, like.
Right. So when I first was looking at your book, I my first impression was it's very sort of, the topic seems very niche, but in fact it's much more far-reaching, than you might think. And so I'm wondering if you could explain how you would situate your title and the body of work that you've guided and helped foster since the beginning of your career, or how does it support or tie Indigenous studies together?
You're certainly accurate in that I wanted, if I was going to take a nationalist approach, I would need to focus on my own nation, so Cree-Métis body of writers that haven't been focused upon, but that there's so much more work that lies out, in several other nations, across the country, that I think there's still lots and lots of room for that work to happen. But I think the contribution to the general field is to appreciate and the necessity of including your own experience, and through the extension, your family's experience, that actually will have very specific national interpretations, but it will also have wider experiences, that other Indigenous people can understand. So I think it's also just amazing to me how much work in just Cree-Métis writing has never really been examined. I mean, James Satie, certainly Christina Bidwell has done some work on him, but really very few others have. Edward Ahenakew, there's so much more work that could be done on him. Jim Brady, is probably the leading Indigenous intellectual of the 20th century, and we still don't have an anthology of all his writings. So there's, I feel as though it's not that it just has to be, obviously there are many other intellectuals from other nations that also need to be looked at. And I think this book is a reminder to go back and look at what has been neglected.
You just heard from Dr. Deanna Reder. Dr. Reder is the current chair of the Department of Indigenous Studies at Simon Fraser University and author of Autobiography as Indigenous Intellectual Tradition, Cree and Métis âcimisowina, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. This series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week as we discuss the many ways in which Dr. Reder has helped grow the field of Indigenous literature studies.
The reason why we don't have books by a lot of books, I should say, by Indigenous writers in the 19th and 20th century is because of the hurdles of publishing. That either books were rejected by publishing houses as not, being appropriate, or they were terribly edited, and there's loads and loads of examples of that. And so there was a kind of a groundswell of realization that we had to change that.
As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.